So last week we did talk a little bit about mocking services, and we did cover the fact that we can basically override the fetch implementation. And basically, what we want to be able to do is isolate the fact that our component, the data that is used by that component, is being retrieved from a remote service, right? Now, again, our component, our stateless component, doesn't really care, right? It just wants us to pass it the data for it to render. But our new React container, does care about the service, right? That's where it fetches all the data, and the container is the one who passes the state to our stateless component. What we want to be able to do is isolate our container, right, so that it no longer depends on this data access, and instead it's going to use our mock service, right? And now for testing the container, it's simpler because now the container is not responsible for maintaining a reference to the service. Instead, we're going to pass it as an argument when we instantiate the container. We pass it a mock service, which is going to override the fetch implementation, right? That what we saw last week. But now testing the container is easier because we can inject it instead of it grabbing a reference to it. If you remember, the implementation of the service looks something like this, right? We have a class that encapsulates all the data access to a remote server, implementing multiple finder methods, and then all the CRUD operations, and each one of them implemented using the fetch function, which generates an AJAX over HTTP request. And the fetch function has two arguments. The first one being the URL where we are sending the request, and the second one is an optional argument, which is a configuration object that allows us to configure whether there's a post, a put, or delete. If you don't provide the configuration object, the default is to interpret this as a get. Notice that the method can configure whether it's post, put. Other things that might be in here are headers, right? The body, if you're sending an object as part of an argument, right? In the configuration object. So our implementation of the fetch, right? As we saw last week, we saw that we can override this we can override the global implementation of the fetch by using the just function, right? And then providing our own implementation of the fetch, right? So that our tests are basically replacing the implementation of the fetch with our own implementation. So whenever somebody calls the fetch, like the service, instead of using the default implementation, our implementation will be called. Now notice that we have two arguments this time. Not only we have the URL, but we also have the config, right? And because we can be more granular, right? We want to totally override the implementation. Even whatever behavior we have on the server, right? We want to bring that over here, right? So that we can test that thoroughly. So we have the URL, the configuration, and then our own implementation. So depending on the method in the configuration attribute argument, we can handle it in different ways, right? If there is no config, then we can assume that this is a get. If the method is a post, we would implement here post. If it's a put, if it's a delete, we would have space for handling all different types of interactions with the remote server, right? For the get, so if it's a get, right, there's no config, and now we can look at the URL, and depending on the URL, we might respond with different values, right? If the URL has the pattern of API quotes followed by some value, then that means that you want a single object quote, right? Or if you have quotes with no ID at the end, then you mean that you want all the quotes, right? So the implementation of these, for instance, for all the quotes, would be that we need to know that in what context do you want these quotes. Typically, the context is that we have to mimic what the fetch does, right? The fetch What the fetch does is it does a AJAX call, and then when it comes back, right, it wraps it parses the whatever came back from the server. It parses it. It converts that string representation from the body, converts it into a JSON object, and so we have to mimic that, right? Whoever's calling this is going to expect that it's the same API, right? And so the fetch implementation that we're overriding had an invocation to a JSON function that parsed the body of the response into an actual JSON object. So we're mimicking that by replacing the implementation of the JSON with our own function, which just returns the quotes. Right? These are the quotes from the mock file. We're just returning that. And then the fetch implementation wraps that response with a promise. So that's what we're doing here. We are simulating that behavior by wrapping our own response in a promise. Right? Because whoever is waiting for this, right? It expects this API. They expect to be able to call .then on it, right? So they expect the promise API, right? So they can call .then on it. If this were a post, right? We can look at the driven here by config.method equal post. If this were a post, typically the whoever's calling the post, typically they will in the config. Not only the method is post, but they would typically be sending a stringified version of the data they're sending over to the server, right? And so what we're going to do is that we want to if we want to simulate the server, what the server would do is that they would somehow come back to us with a new array that has all the quotes that were there originally, plus this brand new quote that we sent over, right? But we're not using the server. Instead, we're using all local variables, right? So we loaded the quotes before from the local file. What we're doing is that, hey, you know that stringified version of the quote? And I'm going to parse it back to JSON. I know it was stringified. I'm going to parse it back to an actual JSON object, and I'm going to push it into the array of quotes, the local quotes array, right? Because this is what really would have happened on the server side, but we don't have the server. So we're doing all this all on the client side. Now I have a brand new quote, quotes, and I'm going to wrap it instead of a promise, instead of a JSON function, and then return that quotes that now has 3 quotes. Or if I call it 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, it'll have more quotes. Right? I can verify this behavior in the user interface. Make sense? So basically, what we're doing is we're entirely replacing the implementation of the server, the implementation of the controller, the implementation of the service layer on the client side. Make sense?